in New York that are public schools. They don't have any extra funding. But what's different about them is they actually have a waiver. They were founded in the early 90s, and they've had a waiver ever since to not give the state standardized tests. And so if you went by the measures of the testocracy, they would be the very worst schools in New York, right? They would have to be, because they don't have the accountability measures that you would need to have high achievement, right? They would have to have the highest gaps between white students and students of color because they don't have the accountability measures you would need to close what they call the achievement gap. The problem for the testocracy is that the New York consortium that do not have standardized testing are the very best schools in New York City by almost every measure. They have the highest graduation rates. They have the highest rates of college attendance. Their students complete college at far higher rates. Their outcomes for their English language learners are off the charts. They have 86% of their black graduates accepted into college compared to 37% nationally, right? And they do this with performance-based assessments that are like when you get your PhD. At that level, they want you to think. They don't want to know, can you eliminate wrong answer choices? They want to know, can you make an argument? Can you back it up with evidence and do research? And that's what these students do. They do research over time, work with a mentor at the end of the term. They have to defend their dissertation in every subject, right? And it's actually more difficult but more meaningful because it's the type of work they'll actually be engaged in when they leave the schools. And I think that it's actually really urgent that we move to a system of assessment that values critical thinking and collaboration and creativity, because I think our society is in deep crisis today. We have all sorts of incredible catastrophes that are being inflicted on our people in this country. We have the greatest income inequality in US history, where 56 people have, I think it's 62 people have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people on the planet, right? And you have, for the first time in US history, at least in 50 years, you have the majority of students in the public education system living in families who are in poverty. You have a mass deportation system in this country. Record numbers of deportations that are splitting families apart all across the country. You have new bigoted laws being passed in places like North Carolina against LGBT people, right? You have endless wars where we have trillions of dollars to bomb people in the Middle East, but not to educate them here at home. We have a mass incarceration system in this country that has made the fact that there's more black people on probation, on parole, or behind bars than were slaves on plantations in 1850, right? We have a climate catastrophe that's hurtling towards us, and our country is still allowing corporations to invest in fossil fuels. And it's rapidly coming to a head, because if we don't solve this problem, the planet will no longer sustain human life. These are the real high stakes that we face in our society, and none of those problems can be solved with rote memorization, with ABCD thinking, right? We have to develop critical thinking and courage and creativity to solve those problems. So I just want to end with one thought today that came from a student that wrote, well, she actually wrote a speech for her high school graduation. And I included the speech in the book, and I think it really is emblematic of the new turn that young people are taking today and standing up and fighting back against these tests. You know, we've entered the period in U.S. history of the greatest resistance against high-stakes testing ever. And I think Amber Kudla's voice is one that really symbolizes why so many people are fighting back. And she was the valedictorian of her class in a New York State high school a couple years ago. And her principal said that she had to give the graduation speech. It was tradition. And she said, absolutely not. I don't have anything to add, and I'm not a public speaker. And he said, you don't have to, but you'd be shaming our school and your family. So she relented, and I think that the principal was probably wished that he hadn't pushed her so hard to give this speech when it came out. Because the first sign that this was going to be a different kind of speech was the title she gave her speech. And they printed the title in the hundreds of pamphlets that were handed out to all the attendees, all the families assembled. And the title of the speech is 518-455-4767, which was the phone number of the state legislator who was pushing all the high-stakes tests in their state. And then she said, I'm just going to read a short part of this excerpt, but she said, as for the argument that the assessments are challenging our students more, sure, that's true. It's a challenge to fit the same amount of material into 1 year with more exams. It's a challenge to memorize loads of facts in time for the next tests. It's also a challenge to eat a teaspoon of cinnamon in one bite without choking. But what are you really accomplishing? At this point, I'd like to throw a slightly relevant quote by a famous person into the mix to make my speech seem more legitimate. That appears to be how these things work. So Albert Einstein once said, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid. We can't judge someone's intelligence by how well he does in a small group of isolated classes. Everyone learns differently, so education is not something that can be successfully standardized. Anyway, she ends on this brilliant point. She says, anyway, this is why I tried so hard to get out of this speech. Not because I don't respect you all, I do. It's just that valedictorian is a label, and I don't respect what it stands for. I am not the smartest person in our class. I could learn something new from every single one of you. I'm good at memorizing things, but that's not so useful outside of the standardized world of high school. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you have been more successful than I was, unless your standard for judging success is a Scantron sheet. And I think that what the students did here in New Mexico, walking out, and this uprising that is sweeping our country is about reclaiming public education, to make it about empowering our students to solve the problems they face in their world, to bring back the arts, to bring back physical education and recess, to bring back creativity and the things that mean so much to our kids and so little to the testocracy and the billionaires who are trying to steal our kids' future. And I'm so happy that right here in New Mexico, we're not going to let that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. So now we're going to move into the panel part of this. So we have some great panelists, and at this time I'll have you guys introduce yourselves, just talk a little bit about testing and where you are in Santa Fe.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. So my name is Elena Robles, and I'm a senior at Santa Fe High School. I've been part of the public school system my entire life, And currently I'm part of the Inspire Mentorship Program, the same that Carly's a part of, and my mentorship is in journalism. So all this year I've researched and written pieces about park testing and ESL or English language learner testing and the programs available at Santa Fe High in particular, and mostly regarding the lack of communication at our school about the test and how it affects our graduation, and kind of the panic that ensued with our student population when all of the test scores came out, and how no one really knew what any of them meant. So that's kind of my experience, along with being a student who's been involved with standardized testing my whole life.
My name is Kira Jones, and I'm a mother, a writer, an educator, and an activist. And I'm really here tonight as a parent, which is a little bit interesting because I spent much of my professional life in education reform and in the charter school movement and fighting against standardized testing. So I'm really honored to be here, and it's so great to look out and see so many students. And my mother said, you know, I'm really excited that you're going to be on this panel, but you might want to have a glass of wine beforehand, because she knows how heated up I might become. But I'm really here tonight representing my daughter, Allie Rose, and her future and her misery in the face of the testing takeover, which I know we're going to talk more about. So.
Hi, I'm Jody Lefevers. I currently teach at the master's program housed out in the Santa Fe Community College. I've been teaching now for 26 years, and it's been a great path for me. I taught for a number of years in public schools, both rural, inner city, and then I went into the private school world for 12 years, and recently came out of the private school world and back into public school for a lot of reasons that are personal to me, but a lot had changed in that 12 years, and a lot had changed around standardized testing in that 12 years. And it's been a wonderful decision on my part, but one of the things that I'm just appalled by is this high-stakes testing, and it's something that's becoming more and more dear to my heart right now. And I guess I'm up here because of my students, who I care greatly for, and this is not right, what's happening to them.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Smith, and I'm the legal director for the ACLU of New Mexico. The ACLU is a nonprofit legal center. We're throughout the country, and we take it very seriously to defend everybody's constitutional rights. So the way we became involved in this is we became concerned about the fact that along with the high-stakes testing, there have been some high-stakes regulations put into place that really, we think, encroach very seriously on people's First Amendment right to free speech. So the Public Education Department passed a regulation several years ago saying that it was prohibited for any teacher to disparage or diminish the importance of standardized testing in the schools. And we see this as a fairly clear free speech violation. It should be, and what it does is it has besides being a pretty blatant free speech violation, it also has the effect of really making it impossible for parents and community members to find out what is happening in their schools with standardized testing. If you have a rule that says you cannot diminish the importance of the tests or disparage the tests, what that means is you can praise the tests. You can say every nice thing you want to say about the test. That's viewpoint discrimination, which is a very big constitutional no-no. But there's a reason for that, and that's because you end up with one particular viewpoint coming out, and that has sort of this Orwellian, creepy thing that happens where all you're hearing from teachers, because they're too afraid to say what they really think, is the tests are great, and they can't say anything else. So that, and teachers are afraid of saying anything about the tests because they could lose their teaching licenses based on this. And so not only does it violate a teacher's right to free speech, but it also violates the parents' free speech right to receive information. Because you not only have a right to speak, you have a right to receive that information. And when that information is being kept from you by a regulation like this, then your right to receive information is also violated. So we're making both of those claims in our lawsuit. And additionally, saying that a right having a regulation that says you cannot disparage or diminish the importance of the tests, what does that mean? That's a very vague thing to say. So what does it mean to disparage the tests? For many teachers, they're afraid that just by saying you have a right to opt out, that could be considered disparaging or diminishing the importance of the test. So many teachers are too afraid to even tell people that they have a right to opt out, even though that right exists. Or to say, you know what, you should see for yourselves, here's a website where you can see about this. Even that could be considered diminishing or disparaging. So it's too vague for one. That's another problem with it. And another issue is that it's overbroad. It has no bounds. It says you shall not disparage or diminish the importance of the test. Well, what does that mean? How about at home? How about on Facebook? How about outside of school when you're talking to your friends? Or at a school board meeting? Or at a protest? So it's not just limited to your in-class speech, it's limited, it has no limits. So there are a great many problems with this particular regulation and how it affects students, parents, and the school community as a whole, because it really casts a shadow over the whole system where people feel very afraid to say anything. And so we recently filed a lawsuit at the end of March challenging this in the New Mexico courts. And we have really brave teachers in Albuquerque and in Santa Fe and parents who've stepped up to challenge this. And we're looking forward to moving forward with this and hopefully getting this regulation declared unconstitutional.
Okay, thank you. Briefly, we also have our friends from Albuquerque, the Southwest Organizing Project back there. Raise your hand, Albuquerque. Woo! They're awesome. They're here to help us answer some questions about your rights, especially about opting out at the end of this during Q&A. So let's start with Elena. Elena, how have you seen testing change throughout your public school career, and how has testing generally affected your education?
Okay, well, beginning with the first question, I would say my experience with standardized testing has changed in the sense that it used to be one test that I had to worry about. I used to have the SBA in elementary school and middle school, and that was it. And it was a part of every year we took it, it was a part of the curriculum. It didn't really affect my school year that much, and I was used to it, and I knew how to take it, and everything was clear about what it meant and what it did and how to do it. And that changed when I got to high school, being that there were many tests for different things that I had no idea what the difference was between them, seeing as they were all just labeled standardized tests, particularly in math and English. And throughout my high school career, even that has changed in that they were not only testing me, but then also testing the school and testing the teachers for, again, things that were not necessarily clear to the parties involved, me and the teachers and the other students. And I've definitely found that communication has been lost, and that's been one of the biggest things that I've found to be different, or the hardest things about standardized testing. One of the hardest things about the whole thing at Santa Fe High and in high schools. When I was interviewing people for my article about the PARCC test, I asked a lot of them, underclassmen and upperclassmen, people who were going to graduate this year and people who, just joined Santa Fe High. I asked them what they knew about the PARCC test, what they knew about how the scores would affect their graduation. and I got wildly different answers from everybody. I got different answers from teachers. I got different answers from administrators. And it was shocking, really, because I didn't know going into it all of the facts about opting out and about what happened to the students who walked out my junior year. And none of them knew what it meant to walk out and how it would affect them. None of them knew about the attempts, how you had to attempt the test 3 times to use an alternate form to show proficiency. It's all a mess. It's all very confusing. A lot of people, I talked to the senior counselor at Santa Fe High, and I asked him how it's been affecting him, and he said that he was having students and teachers coming in completely panicked, not teachers, students and parents coming in completely panicked because they didn't know how it was going to affect their graduation. They didn't know what the numbers meant, especially because the numbers were often really negative and most people were failing the PARCC test. So the lack of communication, I think, has been one of the biggest things that I've found to be worrisome about the whole standardized testing issue. As a student, not knowing how it's going to affect me or affect my graduation is a scary thing, and a lot of people won't take the initiative to find out, so that's a scary thing. The second question was how it's affected my education.
Yeah, I think you touched on that.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about your experience in AP Spanish and how testing happens in that class?
Yeah, so I've been on the Spanish track since freshman year, and I'm in AP Spanish this year with a great teacher, Randy Grillo, who wanted to be here today. But he is also an ESL teacher, so English as a second language, or ELL, one of 2, I believe, at Santa Fe High. And so he has to deal with all of the testing that comes with that program as well, which is a lot. And I'm currently writing a piece about the ESL program at Santa Fe High and in the district. So I'm doing more research on that. But in general, it seems like to me, and the way that Grillo has explained it to me, it seems like the program is primarily based on testing for those students who are not English speakers. And what's happened with this year being in that class, students have been taken out of class a lot to take tests to check their proficiency in English and Spanish. And sometimes they're 2 hours long, and they're being taken out of multiple classes. They're being taken out of AP classes to go to the library and make sure they can still speak Spanish, which is strange to me. I was taken out too because I'm in an AP level class, and it was different for me because I'm not a native Spanish speaker, but I was still tested. I was still taken out of the class simply because I was in an AP level class. And again, this is not something that's explained. It's really just you have to go now. You have to go to the library to take a test. It's not something that's really explained. And I know that Grillo has, and the other ESL teachers have grievances with the time lost in their classes, in their ESL classes for testing. They're losing a lot of instructional time to teach English for students to go test in Spanish. So.
Thank you, Elena. So, Kira, you're next. How do you make your decisions about whether or not to let your student test?
Just take a deep breath. I actually made the decision before, early on, to not opt my daughter out because I now realize I was part of this, completely constructed culture of fear. And I think that, to me, is one of the most important pieces of this, is that it's a construct and that it's holding everyone hostage. And that is the most mind-blowing piece to me. Like, not only is it smashing the spirits of our teachers and our kids, but like everybody's held hostage. You heard it from the ACLU, right? And so I was afraid that if I opted my kid out, she would be ostracized, she would be singled out, she would be teased, she would be sitting in the office, you know, twiddling her thumbs also for, you know, hundreds of hours a year. But this year we have made the decision together to opt out, which I think we're both pretty excited about. She's nodding. And I wanted to read a few. I did a little interview with Allie for the purposes of this panel, and I want to say I didn't ask her any leading questions, but I'm sure I did. But one of the first things I asked her if there was anything she liked about, you know, testing, and she said, "I like the candy. Teachers give us gum or Jolly Ranchers, but you can also bring your own." And I just want to point out they also get popsicles in detention for, you know, being tardy, which is a whole other conversation. And then she said, "What I don't like is that the testing takes away from educational subjects," her words, "like reading, science, math. Sometimes it takes away recess. It also takes away art, technology, PE." She said, you know, they don't even get up to, these are little kids. These are like little kids in elementary school. They can't pee, they can't drink water, but, you know, I guess they can have candy. And then she looked at me and she said, "It takes away everything." And I said, "Right, you know, it takes away everything." And then she said, you stress a lot because you feel like," this is a 9-year-old, "you stress a lot because you feel like your whole life depends on it. And then you just get the answers wrong because you feel like you won't graduate to the next grade. It doesn't help me learn or prepare for life. I think it's supposed to help the school get a good grade so more people come there. I think teachers feel stressed too. Not all teachers specialize in testing." And then she said, "I feel nervous because I think I'm going to fail. Then I feel okay for a little while. Then I worry about the next test." So that's late.
Thank you, Kira. Jody, how do standardized tests impact your teaching? Do they make you a better or a worse teacher, and why?
That's a big question. I'll try to just blend all that into one. Well, they definitely do not make me a better teacher, I can say that. And I'm not sure I could say that they, you know, personally make me a bad teacher or a worse teacher. One thing that, and I can speak to this currently because we start our park testing at our school at the master's program on Monday. 2 weeks, 8 days of testing. Each student in the junior year about 16 hours of testing. I would say it'll make me ineffective. I have to give up that instruction time, and I teach mainly seniors, so I don't really, my students aren't touched directly, but you know, I'm in the middle of a research project right now. There's no computers starting next week. We have no computers available for research. And so I'm dead in the water there. In one of my classes, it is the perfect time to begin this novel that the students just love year after year, and it really is a nice ending point for my semester. I've got to put that off for 2 weeks, and because basically for all my classes, a third of the students will be missing every class. And I can't go forward really without a third of the students. It's not fair to that third who's sitting in this testing. So there's no reading, there's no writing, there's no critical analysis. There's no connecting with students really in a meaningful way for basically 2 weeks out of a 16-week semester. You know, and then at the end of the semester, I'm really insulted by this thing that we call the EOC, the end of course exam, where after 16 weeks with students and working really directly with them and having them write and improve that writing and thinking and really doing some wonderful things in my classroom that I really enjoy, I don't get to write my final. Somebody else writes the final that my students should take based on what I taught. I don't get to see that final. I don't know what's on it. I guess my evaluation's partly based on it. You know, and so I feel really ineffective during these times is probably what comes to mind most. And I want to say a few more things real quick. we've tried our best, at the master's program. My head Ann's here. We've looked at the data from Park. We've like, well, if we have to do this thing, let's at least try to make it as useful a tool as we possibly can. We brought in a consultant, and we did what was called a data dive. Hours spent and she had actually already done a lot of the work for us. So what could we gain from this test, if anything? Let's use it to the best of our ability. And we sat and listened and discussed, and what I took away from this data dive was that we have pretty good students, they're doing pretty well, but we need to spend more time in reading, writing, math, and science. And the irony and how ludicrous this all is, but our students, they take it with a grain of salt and they approach it with a good attitude. But I think for me, and I know from a lot of my faculty, if not all, agree, and Jess was out talking yesterday and really got people fired up in such a good way, and thank you so much for coming out. But this isn't what's best for students in any way. And it's just been, for me, a real eye-opener. And we approach it as best we can as parents and as faculty. But this is really, it's not serving our students in any way that I can see from my personal viewpoint. So I hope that covered that.
Thank you, Jody. So, Alex, I think you talked a lot about the ACLU's work already. You explained it. If you have anything else to add about standardized testing in New Mexico specifically and what the ACLU is doing.
Sure. I'd like to point out some of the ways in which the free speech consequences of this, in certain ways that this really plays out in, and give you some concrete examples. So one way that we see the free speech consequences here as being particularly dramatic is when you have students who have learning disabilities, special education needs, or any sort of issue that makes testing particularly difficult for them. So you might have a parent come, we have many examples of parents who will go to teachers and say, hey, my student has this particular issue. I am concerned about their ability to take this test. What do you think? Do you think this is appropriate for my child? And then the teacher simply has to say, you have to make that decision and I can't say a thing about it. And you'll just have to make that decision on your own. And parents say, yeah, but you're my kid's teacher. And so you're the person who actually, I don't know what these tests are like. Can you tell me, what do you think? I can't tell you anything about this. You're just gonna have to make that decision on your own. And so here's an example of how that played out. One of the plaintiffs in our case, named Mary Mackey, she had a student who had some serious learning disabilities and could not read the testing material at all. So the student would look at the page and then look at the teacher, and the teacher would hold up 5 fingers and say, this is A, this is B, this is C, this is D, and this is E. Pick a finger. And then the kid would pick a finger, not knowing anything about what the student just read, and that would go on and on throughout. And as you can imagine, it was extremely frustrating for the child, and in no way, shape, or form is helping this kid's education. In fact, it's just making that kid miserable and making their education horrible. And the teacher could say nothing to their parents about how this was affecting the student, because otherwise their teaching license could be taken away. So that's a concrete example of where this can go very wrong. One of our parents, who's a plaintiff in our lawsuit, said she had a student, her daughter is dyslexic, and she said to her teacher, how is this, is this gonna be more challenging for my child? Is this appropriate for my child? And the teacher simply had to say, you're just gonna have to make that decision on your own. I can give you no information about this at all. And so you can see what a difficult position this puts students and teachers in, and parents. And so it's very frustrating. So those are some examples of how this actually plays out.
Thank you. So to conclude this portion, we're going to ask all of you what you think is an effective way to evaluate students. And Jesse, I know you already talked a little bit about this, but if you want to talk again, that's... So what do you think is an effective way to evaluate students?
So one thing I didn't mention about our partnership with Garfield High School and the New York Consortium for Performance-Based Assessments, we've been having our faculty fly there over the last few years. Our principals have been there 3 years, and one of the things we got from them that we're implementing at Garfield is this matrix in the history department. So we met with families on several different family nights with some of the Black Student Union families, and we asked them, what's important to you? What history and what skills do you think students, you want your kids to graduate with? And we compiled that list into a matrix, and now we've designed our curriculum around those. Instead of the Common Core state standards, we're saying this is what our community values. And so now the students work towards meeting each one of those skills and each one of those content area and writing reflection to develop metacognition, where they can think about how they're learning, right? And they can think about what they've demonstrated this year that shows they've met that target. And now the students are much more engaged in the process than I've seen before. And I think the consortium schools had great success with it. And I think, you know, if you go to educators and you ask us about how to do reform, you're going to get some incredible ideas that are actually driven by what students, parents, and teachers know is best for their kids. If you go to billionaires, and Pearson is a $9 billion company annually, you will get what we have today, which is the average American public school student takes 112 standardized tests now, because it's an industry, and we've seen that there's such better ways to do it.
Well, what I would say about it, and Jesse kind of already hit on this point, the fact that testing is needed, it's necessary in education, and I think everyone would agree here that you can't get rid of it. But what I would say is, instead of making testing a punishment and something that people dread and something that takes up so much of a school year and so much of class instructional time, is to make it something more like what he was saying, that actually reflects what the students and the teachers, the professionals, what they think, what reflects what they've taught all year, what they think the students need to know to move on. And instead of making it a punishment, something that people just need to get through, limiting how many people take and making sure that it focuses on the important parts of education from a student's standpoint, from a teacher's standpoint, not anyone else's.
I have to take another breath. Here's the thing. We have all the information, and we've had it for a long time. We have 1 million studies on how children learn. We've dissected their brains. We know that high school should start probably at noon. I mean, I could go on and on, you know, until I pass out. But we have all the information. Teachers know what works. We've been, been doing performance-based evaluation, applied learning. I mean, we know what works. We know what paint color to put on the walls. We understand ergonomics. We understand light and, natural light. We understand what to feed our kids and what not to feed our kids. Like, we know what to do. And I sometimes look around schools these days and I just think, what happened? I am not even sure what happened. But applied learning, again, performance-based evaluations. I was a founding teacher at Amy Beale High School in Albuquerque, which was one of the first charter schools in New Mexico. And they still do. We did reviews. We did exactly what somebody mentioned, a PhD style, defense of your dissertation, where you actually have a conversation with a student about what they are and are not learning and mastering. And, it's like that example of asking a student to read in order to find out whether or not they can read. So stop there before I
I think good teachers can sit around by themselves or together and come up with assessment models that are brilliant, and over and over. So I have ideas of what that would look like, but that's pedagogical, and it's a little boring maybe for this. But I think the real issue for me is, like, I'm blessed to be in a program where we have our student-teacher ratio is very small. So you want assessment, I can walk in, sit down in a classroom in my program, and in 10 minutes know if a student's done the reading or not. That's an assessment right there. You're constantly assessing. If you put 36 kids in a classroom, assessment becomes very difficult. So, lower your student-teacher ratio, put really good people. Do your best to recruit really good teachers, put them in the classroom, and then trust them. That will work. That will work, and it'll be, in the end, a lot cheaper.
I have no idea because I'm a lawyer and not an educator.
Okay, understandable.
No, they don't understand this.
Thank you all so much. So now we're going to take questions from any of you guys. Tony, do you want to just shout it out?
No, Jesse, I'm really interested in if Garfield High got a waiver from the higher-ups, and because I know that the New York schools have had that waiver. There was a visionary chancellor there that said, we're going to do it differently, and it's worked.
Yeah.
Has that worked? Do you guys have that waiver? And if so, is that spreadable?
Yeah, I think it's spreadable, but we're still in a struggle for the waiver. There's an election happening right now to elect a new state superintendent of public instruction for Washington State. And I just met him at my union convention. He gave a speech, and I followed up with him afterwards and was really pressing him, because his speech was exactly what the teachers wanted to hear about how much testing there is. But then I came to him and said, at Garfield, we got this partnership. We have effective forms of assessment, and if we could get a waiver, we could prove to you how much more we could do. And he said he was going to work on it and look into it, and we're going to keep pushing and building the movement and visibility around this, and try to make this waiver movement part of the struggle for public education.
So does that mean in the meantime, then you're still testing?
It does. So we have you guys have the PARC here that's tied to Common Core. We have the Smarter Balance test. Now, last year was the first year of Smarter Balance, and we were all debating at Garfield, again, are we going to give this exam or are we going to boycott? The beautiful thing that happened was that the school was flooded with opt-out letters, so 95% of the kids opted out of the SBAC test. And the decision was taken out of our hands, because with so few kids testing, we could no longer shut down the libraries and march them off to the labs anymore, because there was only a handful of kids left to do it. So we didn't have to administer it, and again beat their exam. So it's hard though, because now the high stakes are kicking in, and that's how they do this test and punish. Because now, if we were to refuse to administer the test, the kids wouldn't graduate, right? And that doesn't make sense. So we have to get more creative, right? And figure out new ways to resist. We have to fight for that waiver at the state level and build awareness and a grassroots campaign to fight back against these testing companies.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. In the back.
This may be more of an opinion and a question, but I think when Pearson Corporation and all the businesses that create profit from tests and the politicians that work for them.
That's right.
Create the dialogue, create the framework for the dialogue. So we wind up being reactive and explaining why our tests are low, why our scores are low, and how we could, we wind up being at times looking as if we're not teaching our kids well enough, and we're trying to explain why, come up with excuses. And I'm a parent, and I'm a new teacher, I'm a new professional. And what I see is, to me, the single biggest problem with public schools is they're underfunded. The classroom sizes,
That's right.
there's too many students in a class. At 36, you can't teach with those kinds of numbers. They don't have the resources they need in every field, in every area. so when I think of changing the mindset of general community, I like to think of ways of shifting the dialogue and saying that those for-profit companies are just taking advantage of a market, and they really don't care about public school kids. They really don't care if the kids learn their money. That's just my impression. It's just like there's money to be made in prisons, and they don't care about the prisoners.
That's right.
And I'm afraid privatization of schools is that kind of dynamic. It's just wealthy corporations making money. Private school kids don't have to deal with this. Wealthy children don't have to deal with this problem. They're in smaller classes, well-funded, and they're tested by the teachers that gave them the classwork. The teachers are hired, I assume, I'm just guessing, I'm in public private schools, but the monies are there for good teachers, good training, small classes, and the teacher assessing the students are being assessed appropriately based on the teacher and the community and the principal at that school. And so politicians just don't care about public schools.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I saw Seth's hand first. Seth.
Jesse, I met with a professor at UNM a couple years ago who's in the same camp, against testing, and asked him about opting out, and he's nervous about it because if a few parents opt out, the school grade will go down, and he said that'll actually increase the rapidity of the number of schools that are deemed failing, and so advance the corporate agenda to close the schools. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is taking the test is what is the biggest punishment. So the tests are designed to have class inequality, to have racial inequality, right? The tests are designed to perpetuate institutional racism and class inequality, and we're seeing that around the country. In Chicago, where they took the tests, right, they labeled the 50 schools failing and then shut them all down with the stroke of a pen. So playing their game, right, is clearly not working, right? Taking the tests and going along with the testocracy strategy clearly isn't working. There is a risk with opting out. There could be a risk with opting out, but I think that when you get 95% of parents out of school, right, you make a huge statement. And when you're talking about a $9 billion industry, you're talking about wealth that should be used to lower the class sizes, to hire art teachers, right, to bring back the love of learning, right? And instead, this money is being siphoned out of the public schools to these private companies. And what other option do we have to fight back? How else do we do it, right? This is a direct action campaign, in my mind, in the legacy of the civil rights movement that uses direct action to refuse boycotts, right? And I think we have to use that tool. And I think that we have to reclaim the fight for equity, because the corporate education reformers tell us that these tools are the key to accountability, and that they're really for our black and brown children to help them, right? And we have to say absolutely not. We reject that false narrative. We know that actually standardized tests were brought into the public school system in the early 1900s by eugenicists, right? Open white supremacists who the whole premise was to prove white supremacy. And the stability of the test scores from the early 1900s till today, right, with poor people scoring at the bottom and wealthy people scoring at the top, with black families and immigrant families at the bottom, from the early 1900s when the open eugenicists were doing it, to today what your benevolent billionaire philanthropists are doing it, you're getting the same outcomes. We have to say that is not a civil rights movement, but opting out, fighting back, and fighting for not just to opt out, but for authentic assessments that actually value the multiple intelligences that our kids have, really is a struggle worth fighting for, I think.
Any more questions? Did do you have one in the corner?
Yeah, I think she was.
You want to?
Sure. Maybe anyone in here can help answer this question. I read an article recently in the New Mexican about efforts here in the state of New Mexico to develop a test that's more appropriate to our state. Can anyone tell me any more about this, or is this something I need to go research? This would be an alternative to HARP that would be specific for New Mexico. Okay.
When did you read it? And
It was within the last month. In the New Mexico. I think it's people in.
prior to CARP testing, we had New Mexico testing tests that were at a certain level, and there was a couple of days they'd taken out of school. One road, and they passed them, they would move on. And it was,
Were
they
they
get a
designed
diploma.
by people here?
Yeah.
I don't know. This is all I
This
can
is prior
remember.
to all the corporate takeover and.
This is recent, whatever this is. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, in the back.
I wanted to follow up on Jesse's comment about civil rights, because that's how I see this. This is the testing, the testocracy is bringing about oppression of low-income students and low-income families. The data is out there. It's clear. You can see by labeling schools and by labeling students as failures, you're causing resources to move away from those schools that they need. It's a system of oppression. So my question is to the ACLU lawyer, why don't we have a civil rights case in progress now, or is there one that we don't know about?
Oh, sorry.
So at this point, we're looking at the speech implications of the rules around testing. And so the larger issues around, the larger civil rights issues that you bring up and that Jesse has very eloquently spoken about, those are issues that we have not been dealing with at this point. There are some other things that we are looking into and researching around testing, other potential civil rights issues, but at this point, we're really just looking at the speech aspect here in New Mexico. But I will say this to defend our speech efforts and not diminish those, is that if you want to see something of a revolution like you're seeing in Jesse's school with a 95% opt-out rate, your teachers need to be able to talk about what's wrong with testing. And you are not going to get that kind of turnaround if people are silenced in what they say.
Thank you. So, yes, sir.
My name is Israel, and so I just wanted to talk about a couple things locally. Our Secretary of Education is the head chair of our board, so we deal with a whole different battle of, okay, we now have the ESEA Act in here, so it gives states more say-so in what we do. But we have a Secretary of Education that is not going to allow these types of things. So to organize, to do all these things is really great. You know, it's something that I've definitely been doing myself the past year. But I think we also need to have a conversation about taking it into legislation, because we really need to push certain things out. We need to get certain things in. So I feel like, you know, in the next couple of years, and well, first to go back, right now we're facing one of the biggest mental health crises our state's ever seen. And Agave Health is now leading our state, leading 3,000 plus children and youth scrambling for services. So meanwhile, these same children have to take tests, they have to do certain things that we're all discussing here. On top of it, scrambling for services, finding new services, having going without services. So I think that we really need to change that type of thing. We need to have that conversation of what we're going to do, because we've been rallying, we've been causing movements, we've been writing letters to all the senators, this and that. We really need to come together as a community and really need to start caring about it, because you know, the gentleman here, the young gentleman, sorry, workforce that's coming. We're losing half our population. You know, tons in Farmington just got rated like the fastest population loss in the nation. So I mean, that's just a little bit up north. You know, this all comes down home here. So we really need to start setting this standard of, you know, we're not going to take this and come together as a community, because it affects all of us, small businesses up to big businesses. You know, we really got to come together, not for just the forums, but when we're all doing the actions afterwards and stuff like that. So I just wanted to touch on that because we do have really hard, it's like we're in jail because of our governor and our secretary of ed, you know, because we want to do so much, but they can just go on TV and instant just diminish everything that we've done and everything that's going on. So I just wanted to touch on that.
But I'm so glad to have this conversation, not only my former teacher in Santa Fe Public Schools, but I'm also a parent. And I think that Seth, you asked the question, and Jesse, you answered it so well, that question of when do we opt out and how do we do that? And there are risks with it. And so something is, if we look around, we see a pretty small turnout for this very important forum in our community. And according to the paper this week, the numbers of opting out parents have dropped significantly since last year. So how do we begin to really activate a conversation with our community when there's so much fear around it? And so I always look, what's my circle of influence? And I have chosen for my daughter to make a stand that there's excessive testing happening right now, knowing that if I opt her out of part, there could be negative ramifications. She attends Alvarado Community School that right now is rated B, I think, which gives the teachers a great deal of autonomy, and they can be creative and have some freedom. But as that score goes down, more mandates come in. And I don't want my teachers there, proud of the teacher she has, to lose that freedom. And so I've chosen to opt her out of every other test that's given, because she's given the DEA 4 times a year in math and reading, right? So it's all this excessive testing. So how do we begin a conversation to bring parents and teachers and administrators, reduce the fear, and say, well, we can start with right here. Dr. Boyd, why are we choosing an optional assessment? We don't have to give the DEA. It is optional for our district. So start there, and then we get more parents around us so that we can begin to generate those numbers that make it possible to start asking for a waiver. So if you are a parent or if you know other parents, I encourage you to look into not just PARC, but ask, what are the other tests that my child has to take? Is it DIBELS? Is it DEA? Is it access? Because you will discover that there are so many standardized tests that you're having to take, and you can opt out of all of that, even if you don't have to do PARC.
Thank you so much. Yeah, by all means.
So a lot of what we're talking about are simply just lies and bully tactics. The lawsuit that ACLU has is not a lawsuit of something that had actually already happened, like a teacher got fired or anything because of disparagement. It's because they're suppressing freedom of speech. So the 95% rule, I work at Adelia Elementary School. We had over a 95% dropout or opt-out rate the last school year, or over 5%, excuse me. So it was less. So excuse me. So we were all freaking out, wondering what was going to happen. This year, I think it was like 3 months ago, they told us that we actually had gone up a grade. So we went from a B to an A. So these are the tactics that they use of you could lose a letter grade. No school on record has lost funding here. So I just wanted to respond to say that's one way we can help the conversation and keep it going is by not repeating the lies, is by making sure we're repeating the truth and facts.
Thank you so much. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, I would just say that I do think it's an important point, though, that it's not just PARC. Like that point should be driven home, because when you're talking about 112 standardized tests that the average American public school student takes, there's all these other tests, and every one of those that doesn't have any stakes attached to it is so much easier to opt out of, right? And that could become an immediate movement that gets a whole lot of people on board right away, and then you can build up, right, and challenge the other ones as well. But through targeting the low-hanging fruit, right, the ones that are easier to get rid of, I think we begin to reclaim our classrooms for learning, and we can educate the community about how destructive all these tests are and fight for the bigger ones as well.
I think that's a great note to end on.